So
I wanted to bring up that book of stories, actually, Souls in Twilight by Sir Roger Scruton. It's a series of 5 short stories, 5 I think, is it 5 short stories, each which are portraits of a character at a certain moment in time. I think it's safe to say, Roger, that they're all tragic stories in a sense. What I found so moving about those stories is that these are individuals in states of dislocation, anchorless, seeking depth, meaning, truth, stability, and yet in their confusion, in their darkness, willing against that very thing that they seek, or you might say violating or transgressing that sacred thing that they're longing for. That's not what's beautiful about the book. What's beautiful is that in the reading, the reader, her or himself, comes to a sense of what that longing is for positively, a sense of the stability of love or of home or of relationship. And I suppose what I want to ask following up on this is that seems to me a profoundly redemptive vision that you have in that in those beautiful stories, Roger, that it's showing the persistence of the beautiful and of the good, even in its absence, that I can read that story and have a perception of what positively I am looking for. And just to refer to something that you say in one of your books, Jordan, that even through an experience of evil, one can develop an apprehension of what the good is. And I'm wondering if you could each say something about that either there is a reality to these transcendent things, or there is not. It's either just a construct, goodness or beauty and truth, or they have a transcendent and sovereign, persistent reality. And I'm wondering if you can each say something about the persistence or sovereignty of these things, even amidst our darkness and suffering.
Well, I would say that in tragedy, when tragedy is really effective, there is a redemption offered in this through suffering. That we encounter the possibility in tragedy that a human being can, through the most noble motives, also bring down upon himself destruction. This destruction is no different from the destruction it's going to afflict all of us in the end anyway. But here is somebody who has faced it down in some way, that his nobility of nature and his ability to go out towards others in a condition of love and reconciliation has not been taken away from him. And the spectacle of that is all the more intense because nevertheless death intervenes and takes him away, as it will take you and me away, but without having had the chance to reveal our nobility or even to acquire it. So I think that for that reason, it's very important that in literature, noble characters are seen in a condition of loss sometimes, and their redemption comes because even though they've lost what we all must in the end lose, there is that in them which is struggling towards reconciliation with their own condition and with others. It's the sense that they are living as another and not as a self. That's I think it's a crucial thing that we see.
The Gulag Archipelago is often viewed as an endless documentation of the horrors of the Soviet enterprise, but it was an investigation, it was an experiment in literary investigation. And that isn't what the book is about. The book is about Solzhenitsyn's observations of people in those terrible situations who did not contribute to the terror and who transcended it. And the unbelievably powerful impact observing that had on him, and the personal transformation he underwent as a consequence of observing those people, and the decision he made because of seeing them in their ultimately tragic circumstances, transcend that to transform his life from the bottom up and to write this great book and to reveal the utter catastrophe of that entire ideological movement. And so you do see the light most clearly when it's superimposed against the darkest possible background. And great literature, which pulls people way down into the depths, and in this compiled fictional manner, then it also does at the same time highlight what's the opposite of that. So,
in my reading of your work, both of you, there's an implicitly theological character here, and we can't speak about the transcendent in a certain sense without being theological. Why is it that we can't the lights just can't be completely shut out? I mean, if evil and darkness were the sovereign principles, as it might we say metaphysically, well, it could just be the lights could just be completely blackened, and yet that's not what we see. And I'm wondering if you would each comment on what you take to be what might be a theological articulation of the facts on the ground. If the facts are that you can't shut the lights right out, that they're still there, what's going on there?
I totally agree with what Jordan said about the Gulag Archipelago. And that goes back to Dostoevsky's From the House of the Dead, his account of being in a Tsarist, much milder kind of imprisonment, but nevertheless it was full of...
Almost a vacation home.
Yeah, in comparison. No, I agree. But nevertheless, he described these characters for whom everything had been taken away. But he also notes that in each of them I can find the spark of God, something which Janacek repeated when he made this into that wonderful libretto for his opera. And Janacek tried to show in music how these derelict characters will suddenly shine with that light from another source. That doesn't come just from what they are in those circumstances, but from something higher. And I think, I would say one is always obliged to use metaphors when we get to this point. But it is true that you can find in someone, even in the most deprived and desolate circumstances, that on which you can blow to cause the spark once again to light up inside him. And that is as far as we get to meeting God. But there is no reason to think that we need to get any further, in my view. That's what everybody saw in Maximilian Kolbe when he offered himself in Auschwitz for, as a sacrifice, and why he was canonized. That suddenly you see that there is something else in all of us, which in circumstances, however severe and deprived, will shine with a different light and make those circumstances worthwhile because they produced that light.
And it could be, in some sense, the mercy of God that keeps him hidden from us. Because if you imagine that your sacred duty is to blow on those embers that you described, even among people who are in desolate straits, then every time you fail to take that opportunity, then you tilt things badly towards what they shouldn't be tilted towards. And it could be that the revelation of your inadequacy in the face of that moral duty, which would be in some sense equivalent to an encounter with God, would be enough to tear you into pieces. And so maybe you get glimpses of that now and then, because that's all you in your current depraved moral state could stand of seeing of the face of God.
Yes.
And I think there's something to that.
That's what Simone Weil says, things to that effect, I think. Yeah, and yes, I often heard in the old communist days when I used to travel around Eastern Europe and meet people who are in really dire straits, they said similar things. That God would reveal himself, but in these circumstances the revelation will be something too strong for what I could bear.
It's a beautiful image you've given us, Roger, of blowing on the embers blowing on the embers of transcendence. I'd like to ask you both about the forms of culture and institutional life that produce that blowing on the embers in the individual. It seems to me both of you have a very deep sense of the dignity of the human individual, of the individual's connection to the transcendent, the grounding fact of our existence. What would be the forms of culture that we would say to be necessary or most inclined to foster in the individual that blowing of the flame?
I think the most accessible form for most people is music. And music, to me, is the most representational form of art, because I think that the world is made out of patterns. And we perceive some patterns as objects, but fundamentally it's patterns. And what you want is all the patterns of the world to interact harmoniously in something where every element is related intelligibly to every other element. And I think that when your life is in harmony, then you can feel that. And when you're dancing to beautiful music, you're acting that out. It's the music is the music of the spheres, and you're participating in the patterning of your being in accordance with that structure, and that gives you an intimation of transcendence. And it's not criticizable. That's the thing that's so lovely about it, is even as our society has become more cynical and more self-destructive and more deconstructionist, the power of music has in fact grown, because it speaks to that eternal harmony and the reality of that eternal harmony in a way that mere intellect cannot deny. And I mean, I was always amused. I went to this show, the Ramones, a punk band from New York. It was the loudest concert I'd ever heard by a good factor of 10. My ears rang for like 3 days afterwards. And there were all these like nihilistic punk rockers all crammed into this theater. And below me, there was a mosh pit. And it was like ants on a frying pan. They were just smashing into each other and throwing people around up above them. And it was quite rough. And they were all having this beautifully transcendent musical experience which belied all of their nihilism. And they absolutely thrived on it. It was like, and even the lyrics were harsh and nihilistic, but it didn't matter, because the music, even if it in its rough form, was something that united them in the sense of this like patterned beauty and brought them together. And so exposure to music, people die without music. It's like music is everything. I mean, it's not everything, but
I beg to disagree about the beauty of this particular experience. I think actually dancing is an extremely important phenomenon, partly because traditionally dancing was dancing with someone. The with has been taken out of dancing, and the head bashing and so on that goes on with heavy metal and the like is dancing against someone. You know, the withness of the dances, I think there's something really, we see it in Scottish reels and things like that, where the whole community is dancing in an orderly way, recognizing that their need for law and order and taking pleasure in it. And I find that very near to a transcendent experience. I feel a kind of narcissism has crept into the dance through recent forms of dance music, but I mean, that's my old geezer attitude.
Or is it simply to say that that the principle itself is sovereign? If one thinks about the logic, for example, of Dante's Inferno, which has ever more degraded forms of knowing and loving, that the mechanism of the nature, you might say, the nature of the soul is the same at the top of paradise as it is at the bottom of Inferno, but it has these infinite gradations of wholeness. And so I don't think we have to say that the mosh pit is equivalent as a work of art to Beethoven or Palestrina or Janacek, but rather that perhaps what's going on in that is nonetheless a longing for the pattern and the recognition of the other that you say.
But your original question was how do we coax people back into that into a life which is based on the recognition of the other rather than the gratification of the self, because that's essentially what we're talking about, I think, with today at least. And I would say teaching people how to help others. The role of the teacher is a very dignified one, but it is only so if the teacher actually thinks that he is helping the pupil to a body of knowledge that he has access to. And that sense of helping other people is a very rare thing, and it's made more rare by the welfare state and the ready availability of subsidies for a subsidized life without leaning on any particular person, you know. And I think relations of dependence are actually very positive if they're accepted on both sides, you know. And I think it's something that we don't teach. And the Boy Scouts movement and all that, they used to teach young people these things, teach people how to go out and help those who needed them, and how to make those little day-to-day sacrifices, and eventually, through the process of imitation and imagination, a character grows based on that. And I feel that there isn't any obstacle to this. It's a very simple form of education. All of us can do it, and all of us who have children do it. I'm sure Jordan does it with his children the same as I with mine. Of course, you know, you're always disappointed. They always go away into their corner with their wretched little iPhones and so on. But nevertheless, some of it rubs off, and you know that in the long run they will be capable not just of finding love, but also of offering forgiveness and working for reconciliation. I don't think in the sort of narcissistic culture which is propagated by the media and by the universities that they're being pointed in that direction. That is true. But then it's up to us to point them in another direction.
I think as an academic, we talked already about that place where the meaning and the fact are conjoined. And that's the proper place to lecture from, because people who lecture constantly make the presumption that they're there to deliver a set of facts, but there's an infinite set of facts, and so at the very least you have to select the facts, and there's a mechanism that selects the facts. And what you want to do as an academic is tell your students through direct discourse and also through action about something that you've encountered that you've fallen in love with, and to communicate the love that you have for that, the love for literature, and not to say, well, you should read this book, but to say, well, here's this book, and here's what it can open up for you, and this is how it does it, and this is what you'll gain from it. It's an inestimable gain, and there's some struggle in it, but there's something in it that's of unbelievable utility, and you have to believe that in order to communicate it. And then that opens one of those doors, you know, and maybe some students will step through that and think, well, maybe that sounds like something I need. I'm in this dire situation, and I need something. I need a life raft. I need something to buoy me upward, and it's going to take some effort, obviously, because nothing worthwhile comes without effort, to communicate that commitment you have to these phenomena that we already talked about, to beauty and to truth and to literature and to the classics in the humanities. It isn't enough to say what they are and to transmit them. It's to manifest yourself as a living part of that tradition, and to show yourself thereby as a model for living out as much as you can what that tradition represents, and to show that that's so much better than like a short-term pleasure-seeking nihilism, that they're not even in the same conceptual universe. And people are far more open to that. They know already. People know, especially when they're hurt, they know that happiness is fleeting and that suffering requires a sustaining meaning. Everyone who's lived knows that. And so to say, well, here's some balm for the suffering, and it's profound and deep, and here's what it's meant to me, and here's how you can incorporate it into your life. It's like people are absolutely starving for that, or dying of thirst for that.
I mean, this connects with what you earlier said about the curriculum, that the old way of teaching the humanities was in that manner, as objects of love. this is what I have loved, what previous generations have loved too and handed on to me. Here, try it out, and you will love it too. Whereas the postmodern curriculum is a curriculum of hatred. It's directed against our cultural inheritance. One after another, the works are paraded before us, stripped naked and thrashed, you know, by revealing whatever ideology or power structure is being concealed within them. And that, of course, is not why they were written, and it's not how they should be understood.
It's not why they survived and were
Exactly.
remembered either.
But
it's like, this is the best that the best of us could produce,
Yeah.
and it's nothing. Well,
Yes.
why should you bother doing anything
well, exactly.
then?
And it means that students who go through that curriculum come out with a sense of the hopelessness of everything. And
thus are successfully educated by postmodernist standards.
Yes, yeah, I suppose that's right. But you know, there's no reason why one should accept this. All good things begin in small areas, because two or three people, you know, well, as Christ said, 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, you know, there am I with you. But the same is in all cultural activities. It's perhaps a friendship will begin. Will start up a reading group, and out of that reading group there'll be others come in gradually. If it's founded on love of the thing that's being studied and offered, it will always triumph in the long run over this negativity. The problem is the negativity is subsidized. It's subsidized by universities who are paid for by governments, who are paid for by taxpayers and so on. And the answer is to take away those subsidies and deprive education completely of money, and it will be back with us again. That's my view.
I suggested something like that in public in Canada not so long ago, to cut the budgets of the universities across the board by 25% and let them sort themselves out. But the no subsidy idea at least forces those who provide education to do it purely on its merits. And the fact that these counterproductive disciplines, let's say, have been subsidized for so long has given them a power that's far outstrips their credibility and their attractiveness.
All right.
Now, I wanted to point out, well, this chat may be seen by a few people online at some point, and draw attention to the fact that we're all wearing poppies, which of course is a symbol of respect and memory for an inheritance of our own past, for the suffering that has given us, or at least protected and given us, so much that we hold dear. I'd like to ask you both about memory and the inheritance of the past, and what it means to have a pedagogy, what it means to have a pedagogy of the transcendent in relation to our past. How do you open those doorways, and perhaps if the Spirit moves you to speak about works that you love, that you've been able to open up to others?
One of the reasons for remembering, you know, in the way that we remember the armistice in the First World War, one of the reasons is gratitude, and gratitude is in short supply in our societies today, and it's the greatest gift that we can offer, in fact, to people who are dead, because what else can we do except to acknowledge what their sacrifice? So I think that gratitude is a fundamental part of memory. There are, of course, accumulations of guilt and so on, and those are being emphasized all the time in the postmodern curriculum, all the ways in which we are not entitled to our inheritance. But I would think in the face of that we have to insist on the ways that we are entitled to that inheritance. If people have died for it, and for our sake, you know, that is a fantastic title that we enjoy, and we should feel grateful to them for that. I mean, when it comes to, you know, actual works of art or whatever which have opened the sense of the depth of one's own inheritance, that I think is a very interesting question. There's so many of them, but just to mention only one, the Bach B minor Mass. To me, that's a door into the whole European inheritance, going back to the crucifixion. There it all is, encapsulated in music. Music, celebrating the universal claims of the Roman Catholic Church, but written by a Protestant. It's and offered as a gift, to mankind. And there it is. And such things so transcend any minor historical details. That one recognizes that is what the past really is for one, that great depth of inheritance that can't be enumerated but just enjoyed.
Just to follow up before we turn to Jordan, Roger, at the beginning you talked about how a great literature, a great writing is writing in which the reader finds himself, finds herself. Taking Bach's Mass in B minor, You've spoken about this unfolding of the self that is found in these great works, or the reflection of the self. I know, or at least I think you've written about the unfolding of the theme of that Mass in particular, but certainly in other of your writings, the unfolding of the theme in music. Could you say something about I know that's a huge question, but the way in which the unfolding of the theme in music is an unfolding of the self?
It's a really provocative way of putting it. It is true that when you listen to a theme in music, you're not listening to a sequence of notes. Something begins in that first note and endures to the final note. And it goes on all the way through, even though there are spells of silence. It's still going on in the silence. So that our ability to hear something as a theme is already a contribution that we make. It comes out of us. So we've identified with that movement. That movement is there in the world because it's there in us. But in so many ways, all our inner life is interrupted and unfulfilled, and it's full of things that start up and then peter out. And I think that is one of the fundamental experiences of human beings, that there's an inner disorder, that things never actually come to a conclusion. But here, uniquely, movements begin and come to a conclusion. It's just, and that conclusion is complete. It's a satisfaction of the unsaturated nature of the first movement, of the first beginning theme. And it's an experience. Why do we value that? I think we value it in the same way as we value tragedy, because it gives completion and closure to things that otherwise wouldn't ever have them.
And things that are transient as well,
yes.
Because it does have a beginning and an end. And the end doesn't invalidate the utility of the entity.
That's right.
So in gratitude, I mean, that was exactly the theme that sprung to mind for me as soon as you asked that question. I mean, one of the things that I find profoundly disquieting about the modern radical, what would you call it, ideology that is so unfortunately dominant on campuses among young people, is that it's unbelievably ungrateful. And when I walk outside and there's not a riot and death in the streets, I'm having a good day. That's my sense of history. It's like I'm constantly staggered by the fact that so much works all the time. It's absolutely... I met this guy a while back, and he'd been in a motorcycle accident. He really got hurt, man. He was pretty much half destroyed. And he worked as a telephone lineman. He worked with this guy who had Parkinson's disease, who was equally destroyed in a slightly different way. And the two of them together could climb up a telephone pole and continue their job. And I thought, this unbelievable infrastructure we have that is just an absolute bloody ongoing miracle is sustained by people exactly like that, you know. They're having very difficult lives. In a country like Canada, they go out in the middle of the bloody winter where you die. It's frigid. And something breaks and they fix it and the lights are on. The lights are on all the time. And I come to somewhere like Europe, and to me it's an absolutely overwhelming experience to see King's Chapel today, to wander around this city. I'm just staggered that people produce this, and so amazed that we could do it, and so grateful that it exists. We were talking about King's Chapel. The people who started it didn't live to see its completion. They were driven by this nobility of transcendent vision, and they produced these enduring forms, and out of the bloody misery of history, we've erected all this spectacular infrastructure that we're so fortunate to be part of. And none of that gratitude is taught, and it's partly not taught because people have no sense of the absolute catastrophe of history. I mean, for me, the Hobbes, it's like nasty, brutish, and short. The simplest and most likely social circumstances, catastrophe punctuated by hell. And to see that not happening in a sustained manner constantly, and to see things improving around us, and to be reliable in that manner, and then not to be grateful for that. It's an unbelievable combination of ignorance, ingratitude, and willful blindness. And it does no one's soul any good. It's so good to walk down the streets of a beautiful town like this and to be open-mouthed in non-ironic amazement at what's here. And to not instill that sense in young people, for them to understand that they are standing on the bones of generations of people who suffered to make this possible, despite all their errors, and have brought this forward. It's like...
Yeah, well, Hobbes is a very salutary lesson, actually, because he did look into the abyss and stepped back from it and reported on it, and as did Solzhenitsyn, and we post-war baby boomers haven't had that experience. I had a little glimpse of it in the old communist days, but we only saw the edge of it then, you know. Still, the sense that it is there, always beneath your feet, and that the crust is as thin as it can be in certain places. That, I think, is something that young people do need to be taught, without making them get gloomy about it, but to recognize that they're lucky.
A last question before we open up for a few questions here. It seems to me that the backward looking that we've talked about, you had a wonderful phrase, wide-eyed, open-mouthed, non-ironic amazement, I think. You said walking around this transcendently beautiful town of Cambridge, which houses this august and ancient and beautiful institution. You mentioned, Jordan, as we were seeing the King's Chapel earlier today, that those who started the work knew they wouldn't be those who would finish, and those who finished knew they had inherited a work that they had not themselves begun. And so I suppose I want to ask, we've talked about the necessity to turn back with gratitude to the past, to our inherited past. But I want to talk also about the possibility of building and of creation. These chapels and buildings were built at some time. You yourself are a composer, both of you authors of books that many, many people have found depth and truth in. So I want to ask about the possibilities for renaissance, for rebuilding or building anew, new buildings, new forms of community, new forms of art, perhaps new buildings of old forms of architecture, new colleges and universities, new more healthy and beautiful forms of courtship, new forms of flourishing arts and music. It seems to me so important that we not lose sight of the fact that precisely the abiding truth of the transcendent in us gives us hope to answer that call.
Yeah, it must be the case that when describing our cultural inheritance, we are not just describing something that's gone. We must be describing something of which we are still a part, and which has to change as we are changing to accommodate us. All this was said by Eliot in Tradition and the Individual Talent. You know that the artist must be constantly trying to say that new thing that he came into the world to say, but he can only say it if he adapts his style to the inheritance of the tradition, thereby transforming the tradition and transforming himself. And there is no formula for doing this, because a formula is precisely what destroys the creative act. But we have to assume that new things will come, and they will come through, as they always did in the past, through fasting and prayer, you know, and an occasional glass of wine, in my case.
Jordan.
Well, we could concentrate, I suppose, on building the future instead of criticizing the past. I mean, it's necessary to decompose, to reconstruct, you know. Those acts can't be separated, but the decomposition is the prerequisite for the reconstruction. And you know, what I've been recommending to people is that they start on whatever scale they can start on, with whatever's in front of them, because they have more in front of them than they think. These circumscribed areas, these small places that people can call their own, even if it's only their room, you can start to do something creative and beautiful there. I mean, I've suggested to people that they start by putting their room in order, and that implies a purpose. It's like, well, your room is somewhere that you exist. It's a place that surrounds you, that tells you how to be. Put it in order, so at least it isn't screaming chaos at you in a soul-destroying manner. Make it pristine and orderly in a fashion that suits what you're aiming at. So have an aim. And then, this is perhaps a chapter in my next book, well, maybe you start by putting your room in order, and then you make it beautiful. And then you learn how to make something beautiful. And to make something beautiful is to make it worthwhile, and to participate in that transcendence. In that transcendence, maybe you need one, certainly, and for your future self, which is also others. You know, this idea that people are fed even of self-gratification, let's say, as an antidote to nihilism. Well, take your pleasure in the moment. It doesn't even work for you, because you're stuck with you tomorrow and you next week. And so even to treat yourself properly is to treat yourself as part of an ongoing community. But I would say, you start in the world, if you have some wisdom and some humility, by taking the potential that lies dormant in front of you and interacting with it in the logos-like manner, with truth and with love, and by transforming that potential into whatever you can create out of it that's good. And even if it won't be small if you do that. You can transform your whole household by transforming your room. You can transform your whole neighborhood by transforming your house. Like, these things spread very, very rapidly. And that is right there in front of you, you know. And people think they're impoverished now, that they don't have any opportunity, and the opportunity is hidden from them by their unwillingness to take the steps that are necessary to put what they could put in front of them in order, and to produce the beauty instead of the ugliness where they could do that. And I don't think there is anything more powerful than that. That works. I've had thousands of people tell me that it works, you know, personally, and come and talk to me every day now on the street and say, my life was in terrible disorder. I had no vision. I wasn't abiding by the truth. My relationships were fragmented. I've decided to make something of myself, whatever that might be. I've decided to adopt more responsibility and to tell the truth, and things are incomparably better. And so that's there for everyone to take, and regardless of your circumstances. And I know that some people have what appear to be larger opportunities and more privilege in front of them, but that also makes their commensurate moral responsibility larger. So there's a certain balancing that's a natural consequence of that. So
now, recognizing the nature of the finite, there's a train one of us needs to catch. We're going to have to draw this conversation to a close, but not before we've all had a chance to thank both of you for everything you do to fan the flames of the transcendent for your readers, for your listeners, for all of us. Thank you very much, both of you.